Hi and welcome back to the Chess Openings Explained series, a video series where I go over different chess openings and try to explain the moves, ideas and themes in some detail. The topic of today's video will be a very popular variation in the French defense, the so-called classical variation. I really hope you will enjoy. The classical variation of the French defense arises after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3. So it is a variation for black aimed against the move 3, knight c3, which is the most aggressive move for white against the French. And here, the starting point of the classical variation arises after the move knight to f6. So, what is the idea behind this knight move? Well, obviously, black is first of all defending the pawn on d5 or kind of overprotecting it. And secondly, black is attacking the pawn on e4, prompting white to do something about it, either to advance it or to defend it in some way. It might look silly at the first glance to allow white to play the move e5 with a gain of tempo and chase the knight away, but as we will see, this is actually the main line of the variation and black is not at all so helpless there or without their ideas. But before we get to this move, which leads to the so-called Steinitz variation, let's first take a look at some of the other fourth move alternatives for white. So, as I mentioned earlier, the move e5 is by far the most common move here. We will also get back to the other second big move, the move bishop to g5, just in a moment. But before we get there, let's briefly consider two alternative white options. The first one is taking the pawn on d5 with e takes d5. This actually doesn't have that much independent value because it basically transposes to the so-called exchange variation, which is considered to be relatively dry and boring. So if white wants to play the exchange, they can play it on move 3 with e d5. So and then after e d5, knight c3, knight f6, we get the same position, and you could make an argument that with the knight on c3, this is an even worse version of the exchange variation because the knight kinda doesn't belong there where it blocks the own pawn, and the pressure on the d5 point is not sufficient to justify the position of this knight. So this is not really a big option, or that one that does require some independent coverage. Because if you play the French defense, you have to be ready to play the exchange anyway, and this merely transposes to a bad version of it. However, one move that kind of deserves some coverage here is the move bishop to d3, defending the e4 pawn. And the reason why I pinpointed this bishop is because this bishop is a big option in the other variation, the so-called Wiener variation that arises after the move 3 bishop to b4, when after bishop to d3, this is actually a kind of playable line. So against knight f6, bishop d3 is really not a big move, and I didn't quite understand why initially, but black actually has a very big prescription to basically equalize on the spot. So here black should play c5. This is a very thematic move in all sorts of French defenses, trying to blast open the center and increase some pressure on this d4 pawn, which is now not protected by the queen. Now, usually what white does with the bishop on b4 and not the knight on f6 is they take on d5. But here it transpires that black actually has a very clean way not only to equalize but to get slightly better position with cd4, attacking this knight. Now white plays bishop to b5, pinning giving a check to the king and discovering the attack on the pawn. But here bishop d7, blocking this check, bishop takes d7, queen d4 is the line. And here, this would be kind of playable. I will soon get to why if the bishop was on b4 and the knight wasn't on f6. But with knight on f6, black actually can permit to play knight to c6 because this queen now doesn't have a good square. And once the queen moves, black will recapture the d5 because the knight is also helping to increase the pressure on the d5 pawn. For example, I don't know, queen d2, e d5, and yeah, black just regains a pawn, has the lead in development. Okay, they have the isolated pawn, but black is already slightly to be preferred. And I was a little bit confused, like I didn't quite understand why that works against knight f6 and not against bishop to b4. But as I said, after bishop to d3, c5, e d5, c d4, bishop b5, bishop d7, queen d4. So this is the same variation as we have just seen. But now with the bishop on b4, not only is the bishop threatened, there is also some pressure against the g7 pawn, and because the knight is not on f6, there is no sufficient pressure on the d5 pawn. So this actually is very much preferable for white, and here white is significantly better, while with the knight on f6 it is actually black who is better. That is why basically white almost always plays one of the following two moves in this position. As I mentioned earlier, e5 is a move that we will get to shortly. But another very strong move, and I mean playable move and important move here, is the move bishop to g5, pinning this knight and indirectly defending the e4 pawn, because now the knight can't move because the queen would hang. Now this is what is known as the normal variation, I think, although I'm not 100% sure about the name, because depending on what black does on the next move, different variations with different names can also arise. So I will devote a separate video to this particular variation, but just as a quick overview, what black usually does here is they either break the pin with bishop to e7, but then they have to be ready for the variation starting with e5, knight f to d7 and h4, leading to the so-called Alekhine-Chatard Attack, where white is willing to sacrifice this pawn on g5, or on h4 if you want, to get some compensation. Black can also take d takes e4, leading to the so-called burn variation, when after knight takes e4 we see that this knight can't move because it is pinned, so black usually plays either bishop to e7 or knight b to d7. I think those are two main options here. Once again, more details in a separate video. This is not the place to be talking about the details of this variation. Another move here is bishop to b4, leading to the so-called McCutcheon variation. At first glance you might think, hang on, doesn't this lose a piece? But after e5 there is this move h6, and yeah, black will not lose a piece because white can't maintain this pin. For example, bishop h4 runs into g5, and if the bishop retreats anywhere here, then the knight will move to e4, and it's a game. It's once again a very complicated double-edged and sharp variation. It is by no means obvious whether not winning a piece is so bad for white, but still, you need to know some stuff to play it. And also, last but not least, the move h6 is playable. To be fair, this is something I wouldn't expect at, let's say, average club level, because this does sacrifice a pawn. Basically, the line continues bishop f6, queen to f6, not wishing to ruin the structure with gf6, because after e5, there is no compensation for these weakened pawns, double isolated f-pawns. And after queen to f6, e5, black plays bishop to b4. And here black has some compensation because of this bishop pair and some lead in development, but if white knows what they are doing, at best that black can hope for is an inferior endgame. This is like a line, that's kind of typical for grandmaster level, sharp, very concrete, very prone to computer analysis, but I wouldn't expect it too much at the club level. So last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, by far the main move and the very obvious and logical move here is the move e5, hitting the knight and gaining some space in the center with a gain of tempo. This leads to the so-called Steinitz variation. I think it was named, it's obviously named after Wilhelm Steinitz, the first world chess champion, but Steinitz employed it with great effect in the game Steinitz-Selman, played in Baltimore in 1885. Incidentally, you can check this game or fragment of that game in my video dedicated to Steinitz's best moves. So I'm not sure if that was the first time that Steinitz played this line. I think it is, but from what I have been able to research, this was where the name is originating from. So here what black does usually is they play knight f to d7. Sometimes some strong players do jump into the center with knight to e4, but then after knight takes e4, d takes e4, this pawn is somewhat weak, and the important move here to know is the move bishop c4, because this intends to meet some c5 breaks with potential d5 advance, and in the long run white wants to basically pick up this e4 pawn for free, so they will play like knight e2, maybe knight g3 or something, pick up the pawn and so on. So that is why black plays knight f to d7, and this might look a little bit strange for the moment, because what are we doing? We are retreating the knight, we are being very passive, but we see now that we get this typical pawn structure where white has pawns from d4, e5, and black has this pawn chain from f7, e6, d5. And black will obviously try to play against this center with c5 and potentially f6 break. And one reason why, that black is claiming this is advantageous for them is that this knight is on c3, and this knight is blocking the c2 pawn. So it would take some time for white to play the move c3 and then reinforce this pawn chain. And in the meantime, this knight, it is not clear where this knight will exactly go. So here white has some options here. Some rare moves involve moving this knight immediately with knight c2 e2. This looks a little bit strange, but basically after c5, the idea is to play c3 and reinforce the center. Now this might look strange because, you know, we are always taught, oh, you have to develop your pieces, not undevelop the pieces and not move the same piece twice. And those are good principles, but in this position where the center is blocked and when there are no open lines, the importance of the line development is somewhat less significant than, for example, if the center is open and there are no pawns in the center. So white can kind of permit some liberties, and it is definitely a playable variation, although objectively not the strongest one, I think. Some people also just continue developing with knight f3, but the problem is that now after c5, as I mentioned, this knight is now blocking the c pawn, so c3 is not possible. And it is not entirely clear whether you want to allow black to take on d4, then knight will come in the gain of tempo, this e5 might be weak, if one of your pieces gets distracted to d4. So what white often does here is they take d takes c5, and then they are trying to play like with the pieces. So instead of controlling the center with the pawns, white is trying to control it with the pieces. It is a bit unclear how effective that is. Black has some reasonable chances, and actually the engine already prefers black, but it was played by some super strong players. I'm talking about 2700 class rated grandmasters. So it is a thing that, or line that you can investigate irrespective of which color you are playing here. But by far the main move here is move f4. So what this does is white realizes that black will play c5 and that at some point either take on d4 or get rid of this pawn. And in that case, white is trying to reinforce the e5 pawn so that this pawn doesn't become weak. Now, of course, once again, this is violating the principle of developing the pieces. White is instead developing a pawn. But however, since the center is closed, white is making an argument that they can permit such liberties and that such slower play is actually more justified than it would be, for example, if the center was totally open. So this is, after c5, we have a huge theoretical position with like millions of games played. Like every strong grandmaster has played this at least once. I have had this position in my career with both colors actually quite a few times. So yeah, definitely, you know, if you want to play the classical variation with either color, you definitely need to investigate this position. So yeah, this brings me to the end of this introductory / overview video of the classical variation of the French defense. Stay tuned, because in the future I will be publishing articles and videos on different variations of the French defense, and of other openings, some of them that were mentioned in this video already. And I have to say that some of them are already published on the channel, so you can check them out. If you like the content, make sure that you subscribe or tell your friends about this channel. I would really appreciate it. Feel free to check some of the other videos on the channel, and stay tuned for more content in the future. Thank you for watching very much, and see you soon. Bye bye.